forelock-tugging, cap-doffing MPs to somehow claim that it's the fault of the opposition. Remind me when Keir Starmer was made Secretary of State for Transport. Remind me when Keir Starmer was given the keys to Downing Street. How on earth can anybody with a sentient bone in their body... That's what they should be doing.
Have you just read my notes?
No, I do. It's more of a hymn sheet, I think, and we're both singing from it. And it's a little bit frustrating that they don't do that, right?
Yeah, correct. I mean, we're all intelligent people, right? So create a case.
And could they do it? Should they do it on a picket line?
They could for no or something.
They could do it on a picket line instead of having to answer questions like Kate Osborne had to do earlier. And Theo asked the right questions. Because of the situation Keir Starmer has created, instead of answering questions about whether or not she's worried about getting sacked, she should simply have been saying, how can anybody hold the British public in such spectacularly low regard that they think they're going to fall for a government's claim that a situation created by a government is somehow the fault of an opposition?
That's true. And then when was the last time you were paying £2 a litre for petrol? Whose fault's that?
There we go. Thank you, Ian. It's a funny one. But persuade me that they didn't want that. That's the line we should be in on, right? That's the line they should be going with. This is a strike that the government has actively sought. This is a strike that the government desires because it lets it revert to the only thing it can do, which is moronic, quasi-culture war, divisive scrapping. And here we are, doing exactly what they wanted us to do, having a divisive scrap with a firewall of morons over a strike that the government caused. Mo's in Birmingham. Mo, what do you reckon?
Hello, James.
Hello,
My criticism of Keir Starmer is that he's giving the Conservatives an open goal in terms of allowing them to galvanise the people that they're wishing to galvanise. So
very quickly, what should he have done differently then?
He should have turned it around. He should have said that, actually. He should have used Conservative arguments to say Brexit was there to help give you control and to allow Britain to do things differently. Why are we still having these strikes when you're supposed to have this control? That's how you ungalvanise the people that you're supposed to galvanise. Today, Keir Starmer, all the front benchers should have been going out and say, this control that you've been given by those people out there to enact Brexit, why are we still doing the same things? Why are we still seeing strikes?
I thought you'd taken back control. I thought you'd taken back control.
Exactly. This is what they should have been banging on about today.
Or you say you have taken back control, so we can only conclude by your failure to use it that you want this strike. I think that's even better than your suggestion, Mo.
Yes. And I think rhetorically here, James, I'm going to ask you a question before you go to the news.
Yeah.
Why don't you not think Labour indulges the same sort of puerile Twitter campaigns that you see Tory MPs do on days like this? It appears that the Conservatives.
Do you want me to? Do you want me to answer that?
It appears it works.
Do you want me to answer
why
that?
are we not seeing an army of Labour MPs going out to say Tory Brexit is causing this? What are you going to do about it?
That's the conversation. So you brought Brexit into it again. I wish people wouldn't bring Brexit into everything. It's so tiresome. Says the pot to the kettle. The short answer is that the votes they're going after are not going to be swayed by Labour lies on social media. They're only going to be swayed by the lies that encourage the sort of division that propelled Boris Johnson into Downing Street. I'll give you a longer answer after the very latest news headlines with Holly Harris. It is 11:33 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I don't know anyone can come up with an even vaguely convincing argument that this government didn't want this strike. 0345 6060 973. Why do I say that? Well, there are at least three reasons. Have I ever told you that I sometimes do that without having three reasons lined up? It's a rhetorical flourish. So I think I've got two, but I don't know if I'm actually going to get to three. I say that for at least three reasons. Number one, the firewall of morons, the speed and the alacrity with which the dumbest end of the Parliamentary Conservative Party has taken up arms in favour of the idea that this strike is somehow Keir Starmer's fault. They seem to be relishing the opportunity to lie to their voters again. So that would be number one. Number two, the fact that Grant Shapps hasn't even sat down at the table. He hasn't even engaged in the negotiation process. And number three, reports, chiefly I think in The Independent, that rail track bosses have been discouraged from reaching a pay settlement in excess of 3%, because if they did that, then the rail companies would see a precedent set and follow suit. And at the moment, post-pandemic, the rail companies are bankrolled by the government. They're more of a concession than a franchise, if you have a background in retail like I do, because you nationalise losses and privatise profits if you're that sort of conservative. So when everything goes wrong and the private sector sort of give the keys back, the government has to pick up the bills. And then when everything's back to normal again, they will be put back in the hands of private sector companies so that shareholders and investors can keep all the profits. You think I'm exaggerating? Do some homework, will you? 25 minutes to 12 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Is there a powerful argument out there to contradict the motion? Let's do it like we're proper debaters, shall we, today? To oppose the motion that this government actively desired today's industrial action by railway workers. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Rosie is in East Wittering. Rosie, what would you like to say?
Well, I would just say that it follows Margaret Thatcher and the miners, doesn't it, really? You know, she picked a fight with them in order to crush the unions.
Yeah, but, sorry to interrupt, you should be used to it.
What I found about was that there are silent people in all this.
Yes.
And the silent people are the passengers.
Go on.
I don't know whether they even call us passengers anymore, because they renamed everything, didn't they? And I used to travel a lot by train. I'm nearly 80 now. I've got poor eyesight. I should be taking the train next week, I hope.
Yes.
And I want to feel safe. So I ask first that I can go and buy a ticket at a ticket place with a nice, helpful person, and not have to, because I've got funny vision, have to press into something with the sun shining in it on digital numbers. Secondly, I want to feel safe.
Yes.
And I have travelled on trains where they've been taking drunken people up to football matches and things. You know, it's sort of, if you've got a long train and have 13
I hear you,
coaches.
Rosie. And so what you're saying is that you want people present. You want staff, visible staff on the train and in the offices, and ease of buying a ticket. And you don't want to be using a smartphone or doing it online. I absolutely hear you. I recognise the voice of the passenger. I will never deny the passenger who want to get on. I think that would be a very foolish thing to do. But you're right. The government is doing it. Very, very briefly, Rosie. Would you agree that it looks as if the government quite fancied this strike?
Oh, of course they do.
Yeah.
It's all part of the strategy, yes.
It looks that way, doesn't it? Rosie, take care. Nick's in Worcester. Nick, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome.
Long-time listener.
That's two callers in Worcester today. We must be doing something right. Carry on.
Yeah. A couple of things. I was voted for Blair twice, voted for Cameron, so I'm sort of conservative small C. Could not vote for that Corbyn.
Fair enough. You don't need to tell me why. We're taking up too much time on the programme with that. We're going over that one. But talk about Starmer and talk about the pickets and the.
Sure. So first thing on Starmer, I think he's dead right to tell them not to go on the pickets. I think he should stay well away from it, because voters like me in the middle wouldn't normally vote Labour, although wouldn't desperately wouldn't avoid them like the plague. Just centre, small. Just slope to the left, slope to the right. That's what he's after. That's what Blair gobbled up when he stormed his victories, in my view. Yeah. And that's what he needs to keep on his side. If he goes too far left, it does. See what the actual fact is. People who listen to this program will know the facts, but the majority of people won't. They'll listen. They'll read the Daily Mail. They'll listen to the garbage they hear on GBBs, and they'll say, rail strikers, 45 grand a year. What are they voting for? It's Keir Starmer's fault, because that's what they've been fed. He needs to stay well away from it, in my view. Keep the centre open, because the Tories will punch themselves in the face.
And it wouldn't feel as frustrating for people, perhaps, if he was doing some of the things previous callers have suggested. So if he was hitting it hard with the fact the government clearly wanted this strike, the government has orchestrated this strike, the government has caused this strike, and if he could hit them hard and hard and hard with that, then the conversation about the picket lines, which even we started the programme with today, would not be receiving anything like the attention that it is receiving.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, just on that, I think in general, he needs a better marketing man here, because he's a decent bloke with integrity. And if anybody who's listened to your full disclosure with him can tell that.
I agree with you.
He just needs a better marketing team. He's got to do something about that, because I just think back to Blair, who was, in my view, a fantastic Prime Minister. He'd have quashed this. He'd just knocked this out of the park. But for the Tories now, this is gold, because they take the focus off all the shenanigans that's happening.
And you know, we've been a tiny bit implicit in doing that, but it's the conversation that I wanted to have, because I'm fascinated by the idea of senior Labour politicians being forbidden from appearing on picket lines, even picket lines of a union to which they are not affiliated, as my new colleague Sangeeta Maiskar pointed out, and you'll notice I've now managed to pronounce her name correctly, so my apologies for that in the first place. Speaking of people who've misspoken, I don't know whether you noticed, but I think you just said silent people like me while speaking live on national radio. Or was it? It was the lady before that said that. It wasn't you, Nick. It wasn't you. Thank you, mate. It is 20 minutes to 12. Tim is in Market Harbour. Tim, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Sorry if I sound a bit funny. I've got COVID.
Well, I don't know what you sound like the rest of the time, so we're golden.
Well, I phoned up for the first time last week on Thursday for the mystery game, actually.
Okay. Well, gosh, your voice is very different. What's happened? What's happened since then?
COVID.
Oh, crikey, you poor thing. Well, I'll get well soon. What made you pick up the phone today?
Just because it's been going around my head for days.
Go on.
It's so easy to demonise. The Tories absolutely wanted the strike to go ahead.
They just did, didn't they? I mean, I've tied myself in knots today, turning it into a... They just so obviously did. They're high-fiving each other in Downing Street at the moment. The more people there are sleeping on floors, or people who can't get to hospital appointments, or kids who miss exams. But, I mean, it's madness. It's all our fault, but we're going to be... We're so supported now by client media and the firewall of morons that we're actually going to be able to blame it on Labour. That's what they're thinking.
Agree. But my point is that it's so easy to demonise, and the majority of people on strike are not train drivers. But they demonise the train strikers because they're getting paid good money.
Well, you say good money. It's about a tenth of what you'd get as a prominent Daily Mail columnist.
Yeah, fair enough. But that's their point. That's the point they're trying to make. My point is, they stood outside clapping the nurses during COVID. What happens now when they're balloting for strike action with the teachers, the nurses, the doctors?
Barristers are on the way out.
All the people, the barristers, I heard about that yesterday, but barristers won't probably get as much love from the general public. But nurses,
railway
doctors,
workers aren't
teachers,
getting much. Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, but they can turn you against them.
What I'm saying is that we've stood outside clapping the nurses. If the nurses now ballot and say we want to go on strike, what are the government going to do? Are they going to demonise the nurses and say, "Oh my God, it's Labour,
Yes, of course they are.
forcing the nurses on strike"?
Yeah, they are.
It's a difficult position to clap them one
it's
day.
It's almost as if you've been on your sickbed all week and you've missed one of my mildly viral clips pointing out that they will be able to turn the country against the railway workers. And if they can turn you against doctors, they can turn you against anybody. And how do I know that they can turn you against doctors? Because they already have, Tim. They did it a couple of years ago.
The GP talk, lack of GP services, etc.
Junior hospital doctors a couple of years ago.
The nurses are a tough one.
I don't think nurses will go on strike.
And they're very good people. If they go on strike, it would be so interesting to see how the Tory managed to spin that one against the nurses. You're a younger and more fresh-faced man than me, Tim, because I when I first started on this show, I would have been where you are. And then it was a firefighter strike. I've mentioned this a few times. And I sat here reading columns by people whose homes I'd been to for dinner. People who I liked and respected and admired, some of whom I even hoped that one day when I grow up I'd like to have their careers. And there was a firefighters strike, and they came after the firefighters. And and the point is, if I'd been on the newspaper still, I would not have noticed. It was only because I was doing this job now and firefighters were ringing me that the madness of the situation properly registered. I make no bones about that. I'm very conscious of sounding like I'm giving a towing to everybody who works in the industry I used to work in. Quite how you could move from newspapers to a programme like this and cling to the opinions that you had when you were punting out or working in the context of right-wing columnists, I do not know and never will. But as soon as you actually start speaking to real people about these sort of issues, you realise how absolutely corrupted so much of the coverage is. And as Tim points out, they'll turn you against nurses next. And almost failing to resist the urge to remind you of the Martin Niemöller poem, the famous Martin Niemöller poem about first they came for the trades unionists, And I did not do anything because I was not a trades unionist. And then they came. So first they came for the railway workers. And I did nothing because I wasn't a railway worker. And then they came for, well, you fill in the gaps. Then they came for the junior doctors. Then they came for the nurses. Then they came for, and I didn't do anything because I wasn't a nurse. And we've already done that. The poem's over. The only people that can take industrial action now are the ones that have still got union membership. The rest of us have had it stripped away over the years, which is why many people working in the United Kingdom today are on 0 hours contracts or have to put their hand up to request permission to go to the toilet, which can sometimes then be denied. It's 11:45. 11:48 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we turn our attention now from domestic strife to an altogether more serious situation which continues to unfold in Ukraine. And I'm delighted to welcome Michael Clark onto the programme, a former Director General of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, and now a Defence and Foreign Affairs analyst. It wouldn't be reasonable to expect you to give us a complete précis, a complete overview in the time available, Michael, but I'm struck by the notion of both sides not so much playing for time, but this war of attrition that's underway now, the idea that Russia is advancing but nowhere near as quickly as they would like to, and Ukraine, by stemming these advances, is playing for time, presumably in the hope of getting more weapons from the West.
Yes, and in order to pursue its own offensive. I mean, there's three areas of the war at the moment. There's Kharkiv in the north, which is sort of a bit of a stalemate at the moment. The Ukrainians launched a counterattack to push the Russians right back to the border, and that seems to have stalled. There's the Donbass, which is where the Russians are pushing very, very hard to take as much of the Donbass as they can, and they're making progress, but very, very slowly. And then there's Kherson down in the southwest, near to Mykolaiv and 100 miles from Odessa, where the Ukrainians are making a pretty big effort, maybe to retake Kherson, which would be a big strategic gain for them. And they've crossed the Inhulets River. They are about 20 miles from Kherson city, about 10 miles from the airport. Sorry, kilometres, 20 kilometres from the city, about 10 kilometres from the airport, which sounds close, but that's quite a long way in fighting terms. So essentially, I mean, the Russians are pushing slowly in the Donbass. The Ukrainians are pushing rather more quickly in Kherson, and the war has reached. It hasn't reached a stalemate, but it's reached a period of slow progress on both sides.
It's like a locking of antlers, then, in a sense.
Absolutely, yeah. And the Ukrainians know that if they can hold on to as much territory as possible through to the autumn and the winter, that on present trends, they will receive a lot more equipment, and ammunition is the main thing. It's not so much artillery pieces, artillery guns, as the huge number of shells that you need for them. And they need more equipment and their own mobilization. I mean, ultimately, they will outnumber the Russians in Ukraine unless the Russians mobilize. I mean, the Russian army is only 280,000 strong. It's a peacetime army, which is what it's fighting with at the moment.
Sure.
The Ukrainians can put 400,000 good soldiers into the field, backed by up to a million civil defense people, territorial defense forces. So ultimately, the Ukrainians have got a lot more than the Russians, unless Putin is prepared to mobilize his 1 to 2 million reserves and make this into an all-out war.
Forgive me if this is a silly question. Why the delays on the supply of ammunition? Is it a logistical or political lethargy?
It's both.
Right.
Partly because ammunition is incredibly heavy, so it takes one C-17 global Starlifter. If you fill it with artillery shells and get them to the front, those shells will do maybe 2 guns for 1 or 2 days. You need these Globemasters landing, about 10 or 12 a day in Poland, which they are.
Yeah.
And those shells are going to take a few days to get to the front. So there's partly the sheer weight of armor that's required on the rockets for the multiple launch rocket systems. There's only so many you can get on a proper pallets. They weigh a lot. They've got to be transported. But the other problem is political in the sense that countries are giving bits and pieces. And although there's a very efficient centre in Stuttgart, the International Coordination Centre, which Britain and America is basically running, which is sorting all of this out and coordinating, although that's working very well. Nevertheless, countries are not really fully committed to giving what the Ukrainians say they need. And the biggest problem is Germany, where the German government says all the right things, but just doesn't do them. And Chancellor Scholz will not sign off on shipments that have been agreed by the Bundestag, agreed by the German military, and the German public seems to want to send, and he won't sign off on them.
Any thoughts on why not?
No, nobody knows.
No. Okay.
I mean, whether it's just sheer caution, or the fact that he just thinks that this could go wrong. We don't know. He's a remarkably cautious man. He makes speeches which make quite dramatic statements, which he did at the very beginning, and then he sort of fails to deliver on them. He looks extraordinarily weak is probably the wrong word, but he looks extraordinarily slow in doing what he claims he's going to do.
Which is music to Putin's ears for two reasons. Number one, the obvious one that you've just highlighted in that it puts bumps in the supply chain. But number two, it hastens the likelihood of some sort of split among the Allies if and when he puts in an offer of a ceasefire, or either before or after taking the whole of the Donbass. He will be looking then to drive a wedge between the West, will he?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a wedge to be driven because there's a clear distinction now between what you might call the Northwest allies, which is America, Canada, Britain, Finland, Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and then the Southern allies, Hungary, Italy, Greece, Cyprus, who are really unhappy about the sanctions and would look for ways out of them if they could. And then the two great sort of swings are France and Germany. If France and Germany will go along with sanctions and stick with it, then the whole of Europe will stick with sanctions. But if they don't, the whole thing will not fall apart, but it will certainly fall into two camps. And that's exactly what Mr. Putin must be hoping for, that he can drive a wedge.
Will France and Germany always act in concert, do you think?
No, they've got different reasons. Yeah, they've got different reasons. I mean, Germany is a sort of study in ambiguity.
Right.
And remember, its government is called the Traffic Light Coalition. So it's three parties who normally wouldn't come together. So the Social Democrats, who are Scholz, the Free Democrats, who are the Liberals, who are pro-business, and then the Greens, who are very anti-Russia. Just on as principle, the Greens really are anti-Russian on this. So he's trying to hold together a difficult coalition. France is different because President Macron he wants France to play this big individualist role in the world. One thing that may be the case, because Macron is now faced with a very difficult left wing and right wing, and he's in the middle with not much to work on at the moment because of the elections of 2 days ago, he may have to start governing France instead of telling Europe what to do, which might be a good thing. In the sense of he'll have to concentrate more on his domestic agenda, so he might rein in his ambitions for France to, as it were, lead the Western world in its political relations with Russia.
If Ukraine holds the line, and in other words, if the ammunition arrives, how soon will we know whether or not the locking of antlers, whether or not the sort of the not quite a stalemate as you've described it, but whether or not this current pause, if you like, is going to break?
I think sometime in the autumn or later in the year, right. if weapon stocks keep flowing for another 3 or 4 months, particularly, as I say, the ammunition, I think that the Ukrainians will then be in a position, if they've got to reorganize themselves, because you can't just go from defense to attack. It's a completely different form of military art, as it were. And so they have to reorganize themselves and restructure in all sorts of ways. But you could imagine that in the autumn, they might start to launch some quite big strategic offensives to recover parts of the land bridge between the Donbass and Crimea. And they might try and get they've lost a lot of territory in the south, while the Russians have been sort of grinding away in Crimea. They early on lost a lot of that territory, this so-called land bridge. They might attack that because I think that would be the easier target, and then go back to the Donbass and try to push the Russians back to where they were before the 24th of February. But I wouldn't expect that to start until later this year. And if it does start, and if the Ukrainians do well, it will go deep into next year before there is any sort of status quo ante, where we could say, look, you're back to the start line. Putin's adventure, this crazy imperialist adventure, has been frustrated. It has failed. Now is the time maybe to talk. Maybe now we can talk. But if that happy situation from our point of view wouldn't arise, I guess, until maybe this time next year.
And finally, Michael, have you been surprised by the quality of Ukrainian resistance?
To a degree, yes. We all expected Ukraine to put up a fight, but be overwhelmed quite quickly. And the fact that Zelensky didn't flee, he was offered the chance to, as we know, and he said, no, I'm not going anywhere. He was very lucky to avoid assassination on 2 or 3 occasions in that first week. Because the Russian Spetsnaz forces were looking for him. They were trying to get to him, and a lot of them were intercepted, and there was a lot of rough justice on the streets of Kiev in those early days. So Zelensky was lucky to be alive at the end of that first week. But he's led the country superbly since then. And because the Ukrainians are fighting, and fighting effectively, it's actually reinvigorated the Western alliance and the EU in the sense that the Western world, look, we now know exactly what Russia is doing. There's no argument about it now. We've got to react to this. And the Ukrainians, one of the reasons that they're doing so well is because they're fighting like a Western force. They've taken training from the West, particularly the United States, Britain, and countries like the Netherlands and Denmark and so on have all helped. And they started from scratch in 2014. They were so beaten in 2014, the first big crisis, that they went back to the drawing board, and the Western forces basically retrained them from the ground up to do the basics. And so they've learned the basics, and now they're fighting rather like Western forces would fight. And we see the difference between a determined Western force fighting for their homeland as opposed to an unreformed Russian force who don't really know quite why they're there.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Michael Clark. That was exactly what I was hoping for. Michael Clark, there, the Defence and Foreign Affairs Analyst and former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, helping me keep my promise to you that we would continue to report upon events in Ukraine, even as the appetite for us to talk about it together diminishes, or has diminished from the earlier days of that war. It's just gone 12 noon, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where strikes are still underway. They may concern our conversation for a little bit longer, and it's hard to find anything that we could turn to for a little bit of light relief, because the nearest thing you've got to a story that might get filed under light relief is this sort of ocean of suitcases that's piled up at Heathrow Terminal 2, and warnings that even more holidays could now be under threat. It is 4 minutes after 12, and I suppose the more stressful your journey to work today or to school or wherever it is that you had to get to, then the more you begin to focus upon your holiday. I couldn't tell you for certain because I'm rubbish at stuff like this, but I do occasionally check when my next holiday is due, and it is definitely sooner rather than later. I think it's the middle of July. And now I'm beginning to get worried about whether or not it is actually going to happen. Also, just for the record, I don't know if you heard that in the news, that EasyJet crew who are based in Spain are planning 9 days of strikes in July, which is obviously all the fault of Keir Starmer. No doubt the Conservative MPs whose tweets this morning have been beyond parody will be blaming Keir Starmer for strikes by aircrew in Spain any minute now. But I am drawn to the question of whether or not this is going to be the new normal for quite a long time. Now, I know this isn't the most obvious and inflammatory of questions, and I am intrigued and interested in your plight if I walked past your suitcase on Sunday when I was coming through Heathrow Terminal 2 on my way back from Dublin. So I got delayed quite heavily on the way out. I was advised. I was very, very well looked after by Aer Lingus, actually. There were some lovely people. Sheila and Alan, in particular, were very nice to me. And it just makes everything a little bit easier, even when you're facing a big delay. But the conversation that I started having in my own mind was about whether or not our holidays are going to be damaged, are going to be affected. And part of the answer to that question is going to lie in whether or not these problems are freakish glitches or long-term consequences. And the reason that I'm sounding a bit verbally constipated is because I don't know that we will ever get the whole truth on this
from the people who speak publicly, from the people who run the companies or the official spokespeople. Because sometimes companies are putting a brave face on things right up until the point that they go under, aren't they? Sometimes companies are insisting everything's fine right up until the point that the bailiffs bolt the doors. And I don't want to contribute, by even in my own tiny way, to anything that might make the situation worse. I certainly don't think at the moment that we've got any plans as a family to cancel our holiday or to rethink. I couldn't bear that, you know. I just couldn't bear it. I haven't been to my beloved Peloponnese. Probably for longer I've gone without visiting Greece than I have pretty much in all of my adult life. I could not bear it if there was, God forbid, another lockdown or something like that, or if this situation with the airlines were to get worse. Chaos is widespread across the UK now. This is today's news. You had yesterday there was pictures of a captain at Edinburgh Airport helping pack the bags. I was advised by somebody at Heathrow on the way out to Dublin not to check my bag in on the way back, not to have anything in the hold on the way back, because that would be a surefire way of increasing my chances of disruption or increasing my chances of delay. So I don't know that I would have done anyway, because I was travelling fairly light, but I certainly made sure not to put anything in the hold on the way back. I then got back and I started strolling. Terminal 2 was incredible. It was literally like a kind of, imagine a lost luggage section at a railway station from the olden days, and then times it by 1 million. Terminal 2, there were literally oceans of bags, which you could have just gone and grabbed one, I think, if you were that way minded. I mean, it was just chaos. And the only way to understand the chaos is to fully appreciate what happens when there is an absolute shortage of staff. I meant to explain this to you yesterday. So some airlines now are flying EU-registered planes. It's a sort of a loophole that lets them bypass post-Brexit immigration rules. How many times did I say to you that would be the big challenge for business, would be to find ways of actually avoiding the benefits of Brexit? In this case, by hiring EU crews who don't have UK work visas, but by putting them on EU-registered planes, there's an actual loophole there. So people who haven't got UK visas because they're EU staff, put them on an EU-registered plane, and they can actually fly for other airlines. British Airways, EasyJet and TUI have started doing that by using planes from firms like Finnair, Iberia and Latvia's SmartLink. So there is an example of British businesses having to avoid the benefits of Brexit in order to keep their businesses running. You think I make this stuff up? I don't. I didn't make it up when I told you it was going to happen, and I'm not making it up now that it is happening. British businesses having to find loopholes that help them avoid the benefits of Brexit in order to keep their businesses running. So here's what I need, okay? What I want is a clearer picture than I currently have of not so much why this is happening, although that's obviously on the board, 0345 60973. But whether or not, I mean, here's what you do with the problem. So I tell you what's focused my mind today. It's the strike. The strike is self-contained and comprehensible. Yes, it takes a while for the trains to get back to normal, even after the strike has been finished. Even after the strike is finished, you've got trains where they shouldn't be, and you've got staff where they don't need to be, and you've got problems with getting everything exactly tickety-boo as it would be if there hadn't been a strike. So when we get up tomorrow morning, we head towards the station, we hope that all of that has been fixed overnight. But it's very, very self-contained and comprehensible. So if you were due to be going on a long train journey today, you've had a fairly long warning that you should probably make other arrangements or try to do something else, right? I don't have that with my summer holiday, which is 2 or 3 weeks off. I don't have any sense at all of whether or not the problems that I see some days at airports and hear about other days, whether or not they're going to be self-contained. And these images of carpets of luggage, or David Lammy at Stansted tweeting on Sunday, another morning, another horrid queue at airport security, Heathrow saying it was working around the clock with airlines to reunite passengers, Gatwick announcing that it is actually going to
cancel flights. It's gonna get rid of some flights well in advance of when they're due to fly because it's simply not going to be able to meet the challenge. I suspect Heathrow will probably follow suit. That Secretary of State for Transport, Grant Shapps, is playing an absolute blinder at the moment, isn't it? You've got a rail strike, the worst we've seen in 30 years. You've got airports in absolute chaos, and the Secretary of State for Transport doing an even better impression of Shaggy than his boss, Boris Johnson. So what do we do in the absence of any political leadership whatsoever? There it is. 12 minutes after 12, we got there. Clarity and leadership. We need clarity and leadership when it comes to air travel. Now, look, three things. Number one, I know that not everybody is going on holiday via aeroplane this summer, but I don't think that people who are get filed under privileged elite whose problems shouldn't be talked about. Number two, I know there are bigger problems arguably facing the country. And number three, I know that there are some problems in other countries as well. But the UK seems to have a hatful of issues in this specific field. And I need to know from people who are closer to the action whether or not there is a kind of new normal in place for the foreseeable future. So are the problems in our airports temporary glitches or unfortunate operational snafus? 03456060973, or is the United Kingdom's aviation industry uniquely and indefinitely damaged? You tell me from working within it. I'm not going to cancel my holiday, but I do want to know whether or not the likelihood of me waking up next Monday and being told, don't worry now, everything's sorted in the airports, you've got nothing to worry about. I don't think that is actually a plausible possibility. I think that likelihood has disappeared over the horizon. So if you're in the industry, how long are United Kingdom airports going to be at risk of major chaos? 03456060973, and why? Why us? 03456060973. These are the crucial questions. How long is it going to happen? How long is it going to persist for? What is the solution to the current crisis? And I don't think you can answer either of those questions without also addressing the question of why is this happening to us on a scale far in advance of what's happening anywhere else? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 03456060973. What does the light at the end of the tunnel look like? And how do we get there quicker is what I would like to know. And obviously, if your answer involves any form of leadership or clarity from the current government, particularly the Secretary of State for Transport, well, it's not going to be happy listening. Come back, Chris Grayling, says Bob. You were better than Shapps, who's about as much use as a chocolate teapot. Well, I can't possibly argue with that analysis, although I would remind you that the reason why Grant Shapps is such a useless Secretary of State for Transport is apparently Keir Starmer. So hit the numbers now. It's pretty straightforward. Is this going to go on indefinitely? Can you see light at the end of the tunnel? What does a solution look like? And why is it happening? Why are they picking on us? Why are the gods of air travel picking on Boris Johnson's Brexit Britain? 03456060973. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 17 minutes after 12 is the time. This good government couldn't run a sweet shop, says the boss of Ryanair, Michael O'Leary, who is he's a colourful character, isn't he, at the best of times. We are hidebound and hamstrung by a government so desperate to show Brexit has been a success when it's been an abject failure. It won't allow us to bring in EU workers to do these jobs. To do what jobs? And how long is this problem going to persist for? And finally, because all the best things come in threes, what does the solution look like? 03456060973. Because listen, we're going to talk more about Brexit, I think, in the next year than we have in the last year, because, as I said to you would happen, it's reached a point where you can't deny it anymore, unless you're responsible for it, in which case they're going to deny it for a little bit longer. But what you now have is British Airlines deploying actual legal loopholes to allow them to avoid the consequences of Brexit. So you've got British Airlines essentially renting planes from EU-registered airlines, EU-registered aircraft, so that they can use crew who don't have UK visas. You are literally moving heaven and earth to avoid the consequences of Brexit. And that's just the crew. You know, the real problems seem to be happening on the ground. So how long are these problems going to last for? And can you see light at the end of the tunnel? Sam is appropriately enough at Heathrow. Sam, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I just thought I'd call in. I'm a pilot, so I'm quite close on the ground to these sorts of problems. But first time caller, so a bit nervous. So I think the problems are only going to get worse this summer. You mentioned the issue about using EU crews and EU planes. I think to a certain extent that's Brexit, but also I think before Brexit, before COVID, you would see that happen to a certain extent every summer because obviously there's more flights in the summer for people going on holiday than in the winter.
But from everywhere. So the companies from whom British companies are now borrowing the planes in Finland and Spain and Latvia, they would also be having a huge upsurge in holidays. Yeah,
so a couple of points on that. I think a lot of the problem is capacity for training. So if I as a pilot go to another company, I require between 4 and 5 weeks training before I can actually fly a passenger.
Because different companies do things differently. Is there a shortage of pilots at the moment?
There is, but
that's not really what's causing the problems, is it?
Well, they can't recruit them. It is the problem. There's a shortage of crew, which is why they're having to bring in other companies. But the problem is they can't recruit a pilot because to train a pilot, you need to take a training pilot off passenger flights for 4 weeks.
Right.
And they don't have the capacity to do that. They need their crew. They need all of their crew to operate these flights. So they don't have the capacity to take them off those flights, spend 4 weeks training another pilot because they're so stretched at the moment. And you tend to see.
But doesn't this mean that the EU registered planes, the companies that these are being leased from, have a surfeit of crews? They've got crews to spare.
I mean, these companies. So the interesting case of Finnair. So Finnair are leasing aircraft to a British airline.
Yeah.
And they in turn are using another company to supply them aircraft, but at a lower cost.
Wowza.
So they're effectively printing money.
Yeah, of course they are, and it's money that essentially British holidaymakers are going to end up subsidising. When does it end then? And so you're going to speak specifically and exclusively about pilots. Is there a long queue of applicants who simply can't be trained because you haven't got the qualified pilots to do the training that would have to come off duty?
Yeah.
So that'll end when the summer ends. That'll end when the big holiday season ends, will it?
You'd like to think so.
Well, do you think so?
I think it will go on a bit longer. I think probably spring next year is when you'll get an idea if it's going to carry on into next summer because they can't gauge what's going to happen next year. Nobody knows what's going to happen next year in terms of demand, in terms of...
Why don't they? I mean, I could take a fair guess at it, couldn't they? I say it's going to be about the same as this year, probably slightly higher.
The thing is, with and I hate to use the phrase, the cost of living.
Oh, I see.
You tend to think up until
good point. Shows me I hate those know-alls on the radio. I think they've got the answer to everything, and then they get pulled apart with the first response from the caller.
No, but
you're right. Many people may be thinking, do you know what? We can't afford a foreign holiday next year.
But in normal times, the last thing to go is the family holiday.
Yeah.
People will normally get rid of everything else before they get rid of a family holiday.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about £1,000 uplift in energy in October,
it's going to be on the list. So. Yeah. So companies are thinking, we know we need to train pilots if we were going to avoid repetition of this summer, but only if we've got a repetition of passenger levels from this summer, and everyone is going to be worse off. This is a nightmare. What would you do if you were in charge?
I have no idea.
What? You're a pilot, man. Come on. Pretend it's a storm.
I would prepare for similar levels of this year, next year. And then, if not, you've got a surplus. It's better to have a surplus than not. I mean,
yes, it is, but not for the shareholders. I mean, it might be better for the passengers and the staff, but not for the shareholders. Sam, thank you. And I wasn't expecting this to be directed towards the pilots because I misread the story slightly when I read about crew. It is indeed the piloting crew, the people in the cockpit, who British businesses have had to find loopholes for in order to get planes into the sky. I was thinking it was going to be the cabin crew. So thank you for steering me gently away from that mistake. Another one here. James, I'm a pilot for BA. I would give you my name, but they're the most vindictive employer I've ever worked for. The problems at airports will last for a long time, I'm afraid. BA used the pandemic as a massive opportunity and got rid of 12,000 staff while reducing everyone else's T's and C's through fire and rehire. Thank you, Grant Shapps. Why would you think anyone would want to come back to work for the airline? For those of us left, morale is rock bottom. There's a total lack of infrastructure, which may lead to safety issues, and pay cuts for pilots in particular over the last 6 years, regardless of BA's profit being expected to be back by next year, make P&O look soft. If you think you're seeing disruption now, you ain't seen nothing yet, unfortunately. I didn't want to have this conversation. I just felt that we should, because I don't want to be sitting here 6 months or 12 months from now going, oh, blimey, Mo, whoa, look at this. I just want to know whether or not there is any sense of clarity and leadership, either politically or from airline bosses, one of whom, Michael O'Leary, was speaking on Sky News earlier today.
The government says it's the airline industry's fault, nothing to do with them. They gave you loads of money during COVID.
It's the government's response to everything. Look, this government couldn't run a sweet shop. I think Grant Shapps has ably demonstrated that this morning. The airlines, Ryanair, we're fully staffed. We're not cancelling any flights. We expect to run a full schedule. In fact, we added 200 extra flights yesterday for the remainder of June and the early part of July to rescue passengers whose flights have been disrupted by cancellations being made by other airlines. And the problem here is not one of the airlines making. You've had this government, we've been locked up for 2 years. They introduced their bogus traffic light system that never made any sense and never worked during COVID. Just as we were emerging out of COVID with the Omicron variant and we were locked down again over Christmas, as we emerge out of Christmas, we're beginning to recruit again, and then Russia invades Ukraine. And the problem here, the government believes the problem is the airlines. Look, the airlines want to fly passengers to their destinations. In Ryanair's case, we're fully staffed up. Stansted and many of our other airports in the UK are doing a great job. But we are hidebound and hamstrung by a government that is so desperate to show that Brexit has been a success when it's been an abject failure, will not allow us to bring in European workers to do these jobs.
Michael O'Leary there, the head of Ryanair, speaking on Sky News earlier today and saying, well, I think many of us have known to be true for some time. Brexit is an abject failure. So to bring a political dimension into our conversation, if Brexit is an abject failure and one of the consequences of Brexit is chaos at our airports, how can a government built on Brexit possibly even begin to fix the problem? If your house is on fire and someone is standing in the sitting room insisting that it's not, how can you even begin to put the fire out? Okay, not even your house. If the owner of the building, the landlord, if you like, is standing there and you're saying, do you think you could possibly help me put this fire out? And the landlord is saying, there is no fire. Everything is wonderful. We have a world-beating non-fire scenario. So let's bring the B word into conversation then a little bit, because Michael O'Leary has, and he probably knows a little bit more about running airlines than I do. I think we can all agree on that. Brexit has been an abject failure, and that's why airports are in such a mess. If that's true, what possibility can there be of Grant Shapps, Secretary of State in Boris Johnson's Brexit government, doing anything about it? Well, here's a question. This is too philosophical, isn't it, for a Tuesday afternoon? But can they fix it without admitting that it's caused by Brexit? That's a genuine question. You can answer that. I'll give you the money myself. Could they just do it? I mean, you know how sly this lot are. They could just say, well, we've introduced loopholes to make it easy. We've introduced ways to... They give out the visas. But would people come here? Would you like to come here and be a baggage handler? You'll be a second-class citizen. You won't be able to sort of settle here or make a life here, but you can come like a fruit picker for the summer and handle baggage. It's just going to get... I hope I'm wrong, but it just looks to me like things are going to get uglier and uglier and uglier. Alex is in Leon C. Alex, what do you think?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Nice to talk to you again.
Likewise.
Very complex and broad subject, but I agree with everything that Michael O'Leary's just said regarding Brexit.
Really?
He was pretty sharp when this came around, because what he did was he divided Ryanair's fleet, which is an enormous fleet, something in excess of 250 aircraft.
Yes.
He registered an awful lot of them in Malta and also some in Poland, and set up kind of separate companies within Ryanair to get around Brexit legislation, so to speak. But as I said, it's a huge subject. Things will ease a little when the schedules change in the winter, because obviously there are fewer flights to sun-kissed destinations, which result in fewer obviously fewer passengers. But the big problems lie around airport staffing insofar as, firstly, with ground handling, it's a revolving door because of poor pay. It's a young man's game. I've just spent the last 10 years working at various airports, 6 of which I spent at British Airways. I agree with everything the pilot from BA said. It was very short-sighted of them to lay off 12,000 staff. And the problem is with recruitment that if you slash contract terms and conditions, people won't return. The hours are very long. The shifts can be monstrous. But as I've said, also you've got border force issues. Security is a major problem. If you haven't got the numbers to man the security lanes properly, then it takes a lot longer to get through security.
So you're on the ground. You're talking about the ground more than the air.
Yeah,
which is good.
Part of it,
which is good because we've had a couple of air-based contributions already.
Yeah.
No one's going to do the job you've just described.
No, they're not. I mean, I've just left a position at Stansted, to be honest with you, which was 3 on, 3 off, but they were long shifts, 11.5-hour shifts. And I'm 64 years of age, so I'm a tad long in the tooth to be crawling about.
Someone should write a song. Someone should write a song about that, Alex.
Yeah, they should. But no, James, as I say,
and there it is again. So it's this tap of. I mean, you say what you like about whether people were undervalued or underpaid, but you know, the job was attractive enough for young people from all over Europe to want to come here and do it. And now they can't. It seems to me increasingly clear that it really is that simple. And you know, is Michael O'Leary a Metropolitan Liberal elite? I don't think he's ever been called that before. Isn't he the fellow that was thinking about taking seats off planes so he could squeeze more people in and you'd fly standing up? Or charging for toilets. He was a master of PR, if I remember correctly. I'm sure he still is. But you'd see a story and you'd think there's no way that's ever going to happen. But the fella's got his airline in the paper again. That's got to be a lot cheaper than taking out a full-page advert in the back of the Daily Express. He's just said, we're thinking about charging for toilets. And then the Daily Express run it, or they run it as a story. We all run it. We've probably done it ourselves. We've given them a free advert. Ryanair, you say, well, I might just see how much they're charging for a return flight. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. I'm trying to decide who we should actually call Shaggy, because it's Johnson, isn't it? It's not Grant Shapps. It's certainly not this sort of unbelievable army of half-wits who are mobilised today trying to pretend that the rail strikes are Keir Starmer's fault. But Michael O'Leary there, essentially, I'm going to play it again. I know it's not great quality, but I've suddenly realised this is part of the shaggification of British politics. So I need to explain to people not familiar with the dancehall superstar. I'm not talking about the fella out of Scooby-Doo. I'm talking about a musical artiste called Shaggy, whose most famous track, It Wasn't Me, was a very clever and very funny song about somebody being caught red-handed but still denying it was them. Somebody obviously and completely bearing full responsibility for something that they had done, but then looking their girlfriend in the eye and saying, oh, it wasn't me. It reminds me of the time, I must have told you this before, when we went strawberry picking in Chaddesley Corbett. Do you remember this? We went strawberry picking in Chaddesley Corbett, and I was told, try not to eat too many strawberries while you're out picking them. And I must have been about 6 or 7, so I was allowed to sort of stray a little bit from where Mum and Dad were. And so I picked strawberries, and I didn't really obey the request not to eat too many. And I was wearing, I think, a T-shirt, and I took my little punnet of strawberries to get it weighed when it was time to go home, and all the grown-ups started laughing. And somebody said, I can't remember whether it was the farmer or my mum, somebody said, did you eat any strawberries? And I said, no. And everyone started laughing even more. And I didn't know why. And you do know why. You've already worked out why. I was covered in strawberry juice. I had it all over my face. I had it down my T-shirt. I looked, unbelievably strawberry-ish. If I'd known, or if he'd written the song at the time, that would have been a moment of shaggification. It would have been, I'm covered in strawberry juice. Have you eaten any strawberries? It wasn't me. So who is Shaggy in British politics? It's not Shapps, is it? It's Johnson. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. And here is Michael O'Leary, if you listen closely, essentially describing the O'Brien theory of shaggification.
The government says it's the airline industry's fault, nothing to do with them. They gave you loads of money during COVID.
It's the government's response to everything. Look, this government couldn't run a sweet shop. I think in Grant Shapps has ably demonstrated that this morning. The airlines, Ryanair, were fully staffed. We're not cancelling any flights. We expect to run a full schedule. In fact, we added 200 extra flights yesterday for the remainder of June and the early part of July to rescue passengers whose flights have been disrupted by cancellations being made by other airlines. And the problem here is not one of the airlines making. You've had this government, we've been locked up for 2 years. They introduced their bogus traffic light system that never made any sense and never worked during COVID. Just as we were emerging out of COVID, the Omicron variant, and we were locked down again over Christmas. As we emerge out of Christmas, we're beginning to recruit again, and then Russia invades Ukraine. And the problem here, the government believes the problem is the airlines.
It wasn't me.
The airlines want to fly passengers to their destinations. In Ryanair's case, we're fully staffed up. Stansted and many of our other airports in the UK are doing a great job. But we are hidebound and hamstrung by a government that is so desperate to show that Brexit has been a success.
It wasn't
Brexit.
Brexit.
An abject failure will not allow us to bring in European workers.
It wasn't me.
Jobs.
There it is. It is, isn't it? So there you go. The latest addition to the shaggification theory of British politics. Oh dear. 12:37 is the time. So if they're not going to admit that it's being caused by Brexit, are they actually going to be able to fix it? I do not know. Dan's in Manchester. Dan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How's it going?
Well, I'm all right. I don't work in the aviation sector, although I'm beginning to wonder now how I'm going to get home. I'd forgotten about the rail strike impacting my return journey. But anyway, carry on. What made you pick up the phone?
Well, unfortunately, I don't work in the aviation sector anymore.
Oh.
I was made redundant during the pandemic. I used to work for a very large multinational ground handling firm. I was a team leader, so responsible for managing a group of people whose job it was to unload and load aircraft, get out on time. Ground handling at an airport is a very complex dance where everything has to be in the right place at the right time.
I bet it is.
The right
yes,
people.
That's a great word as well, dance. It needs to be choreographed, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, especially when you've got some airlines, budget airlines, wanting their aircraft turned around in 25 minutes.
Yeah.
And you're taking 200 bags off, putting 200 bags on. You need to know what you're doing, and it has to be done safely. A lot of people that I work with, a large portion of the workforce was made redundant during COVID, even when the furlough scheme was ongoing.
Yeah.
And they're now...
Why did they do that? Do you know? If the furlough scheme was ongoing, then why did they make people redundant?
I don't know. People that were paid a lot more money than me obviously made those decisions, and the cynical side of me thinks it was to keep the shareholders happy, possibly. But the company that I used to work for and other companies are recruiting at the moment, but the pay, the terms, conditions they're offering are significantly less than I was on. So it seems like in the aviation industry, or ground handling in particular, it's a race to the bottom, and you're not going to get the right people in the job. These jobs are safety-critical roles. You know, they need to be aircraft are safety-critical. You need to know what you're doing with them. You don't want to damage them when you're working on them. And the experience that you get and the amount of training you need to operate at an airport, it takes a long time. It took me 12 months as a team leader to go from nothing to being fully trained on every single piece of equipment and all the aircraft that I had to work on. You're not going to get that experience back in 5 minutes. And if they're not offering the right recompense or the right terms and conditions, you're not going to get the people wanting to join the industry.
And how can they not see what's so crystal clear to you and now to me? God, it sounded like a song lyric, that, didn't it?
I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? Common sense isn't that common. And we are in a cost of living crisis. And under this Tory government, it does seem like it's a race to the bottom, except...
Well, it's been going on for a while. I mean... So what are they expecting to... So they're offering lower terms and conditions now to people who might be... So if you were tempted to go back, you'd be going back on a lower salary?
Yes, if I went back on into the same position that I used to have, I would be going back on a lower salary.
So that's a sort of drawn-out fire and rehire scheme, isn't it? Even though it's not fire and rehire because it's not... You'd reapply the next day for your job. They got rid of you during lockdown. I'm still not entirely clear why they wouldn't just furlough people instead of getting rid of them. And now they need people to come back. The most obvious people to come back would be the people that have left. Mm-hmm. But if you do come back, you're coming back on worse terms and conditions than you were on before you left, which is what happens on fire and rehire, albeit quicker than would be the case with you.
Yeah, it's been, about 18 months now since nearly 2 years since I was made redundant. Since that point, I've got a new career, I've retrained.
Good.
I'm now a telecoms engineer earning more money.
Fantastic.
Than I could at the airport. So for me, it's worked out well, but that's not the case for everybody.
I understand that. And do you have any indication or any insight into the kind of... I guess I'm saying whether or not this is the new normal for the foreseeable future, rather than the coverage that I've done in the past and which everybody else seems to do in the newspapers, the idea that this is news because it's man bites dog territory, it's remarkable, it's extraordinary, it's newsworthy, it's actually heading towards dog bites man territory. It's normal, it's what you should expect, and it's what's more likely to happen than anything else.
I mean, I think it's what we're to expect going forward in the current climate. I do want to think we're at a race to the bottom. It's not.
Well, you keep saying that. I'm not quite sure what you mean.
So by the degradation of terms and conditions and pay, people not getting proper pay rises.
Oh no, I know what that bit means, but there's no one in the race. I don't see how you can race to the bottom if you've not got anybody in your team.
That's a very good point, actually. Maybe
that's what I'm here for.
We're all out of a team.
Well, so we're racing to the bottom, as in there's so much labour. I think you can only race to the bottom when there's a surfeit of labour, because it can be, well, if you don't do this job, someone else. If you don't do it for this money, someone else will. That's how you race to the bottom. But there's no one there saying, "Oh, I'll do it for less, boss. I'll do it for a bit less. You can get rid of Dan. I'll do it for 10% less." Do you see what I mean?
I do, and that's the strange situation that we're in.
Exactly.
There isn't a massive influx of workers willing to do jobs for cheaper. Like the Tories were saying, we'll take back control of our borders. People won't be taking your jobs, all this lot. But actually, there's no one taking any jobs now. But the wages are still going down. That makes no sense.
Yeah.
That's what they were pushing, of levelling up and making Britain great again. It's obviously not worked, has it?
No, well, I would describe it as an abject failure, but then again, you know that already, and whether or not they can admit that it's an abject failure without admitting that it's an abject failure caused by Brexit and therefore move to address it is a question for the political theorists, isn't it? It's a question for the philosophers. Dan, I'm delighted that your own personal circumstances improved as a result of that setback, but what a strange old business. Clever people with an overview, if you've got one, the notion that this is emblematic of broader economic truths or something like that, always welcome. Sophie's in Wakefield. Sophie, what's going on?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I work for a small independent tour operator, and we have navigated the last 3 years, probably the last 15 years, of all the things that have gone on in travel. And the one thing that sticks out to me is that we have no support from government. So we have a transport secretary that knows nothing about outbound travel. He has no understanding of how our industry works, and therefore we are forced to find our own way, which I have to say we do very well. So I never thought I would say, ever, that I would agree with Michael O'Leary, but things that you've played to me today makes me want to agree with him a little bit, because all of our industry has been so consumed by COVID and the pandemic and people not being able to travel and the restrictions around travel, etc., that almost Brexit was sort of pushed to the bottom and forgotten.
Yeah.
And the likes of the workers and what workers could do and who we could employ, etc., only really came to light probably 6-9 months ago, when companies are really starting to pick back up again. And what is really difficult is that people want to go on holiday, and I get that. I want to go on holiday. People do. This is why we do what we do. And people get to airports and they're disappointed. And 9 times out of 10, the airlines, companies, etc., yes, of course, they have a responsibility, but they are merely reacting to what they are given by the government. We spent the whole time through
Well, they're
lockdown
arguing about whose fault it is now, though, aren't they? I mean, the airlines are doing their best of a bad lot. It's not going brilliantly, and the government's saying it's all your fault.
No, and I get that. And, that's fine, but we spent 2 years of every Thursday sitting at our screens waiting to hear which random country in Southeast Asia or French Polynesia would be on the red list, green list.
It wasn't quite random, but I do completely take your point. I completely take your point.
It was so random that we had to sit there and wait, and we had to wait and react. And unfortunately, James, there was nobody in government. We have a transport minister.
Are you nostalgic for the days of Chris Grayling?
I'm nostalgic for the ash cloud. The ash cloud was lovely.
It's incredible, isn't it? And I hesitate to ask you this question.
And this is the thing, I part of this is I actually bizarrely rang earlier to do with the strikes, and
oh yes,
just by chance I happen to work in travel, and I think that the travel industry is extremely resilient. We are used to dealing with crisis. That's what we do, and that's how we work. And we understand that people travel predominantly for pleasure, and it's their holidays. And when people get to the airport and they have queues and cancellations, it's traumatic. But, you know, imagine, James, running a business for 50 years, sending people on holidays, putting your life and soul into a business, and the government affects that. And the government means that you can't send people away, and that then results in...
Yeah, but you've not been paying attention. Nothing that happens in this country is the fault of the British government.
No, of course not.
Nothing at all.
The travel industry, trust me, for everyone that's listening, the travel industry, there is nobody that cares more about travel than the people sending you travelling. I can assure you of that.
No, I believe you. But I mean, there's some bad apples in all barrels. But you clearly speak truth for yourself and for the huge proportion, huge percentage of your industry. Of course, otherwise you wouldn't be here next year, would you? You have to be like that.
No, and I think that, and you know, to finish off, sorry, I'm probably going over my time, but
that's all right.
The travel industry will find a way to work around it.
Yeah, but there's only so much you can do. You can't magic up people to handle baggage at airports, can you?
And, you know, people said, you know, why would you let go of people while you've got furlough?
Yeah.
Because there was no clear guidance from the government of what the plan was going forward. So you're having to work
so you thought you might actually have people not flying for 5 years? Or
companies sit in board meetings and have 2-year projections. You're working on a 3 month, 4 month, 5 months. You can't possibly have that plan.
No, that is what I meant when I said someone give me a clever overview of something that I've missed so far, and you just did. I mean, you have gone horribly over time, Sophie. Keith's going to be furious.
Exactly. The rules were changing. Everything was changing. No one could sit in a board meeting and actually plan a
so they got everything wrong, and there's no escape route, as it were. There's no channel back out of it, which is where political leadership is supposed to come in. And if Grant Shapps is too busy doing nothing about the rail strike, perhaps he could get Michael Green or Sebastian Fox to have a look at the aviation situation. It is 12:52. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We didn't spend as much time as I hoped yesterday on that horrible headline in the Mail on Sunday, suggesting that the fact that people who work on building sites are becoming, quotes, woke, end quotes. Remember that most of the British media considers woke to be a bad thing. I think one fellow even wrote a book about it, didn't he? And of course, the construction industry being an area where suicide and mental health problems are fairly prevalent. A member of the GMB union, we're talking about unions quite a lot today, has done something really special. He's called Jamie. He's a GB union rep in construction at HPC, and he's recorded a little message down at Hinkley Point where he works, and sent it directly to the Daily Mail, which is now the same operation. You used to have to distinguish between the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday, because when Geordie Gregg was editor of the Mail on Sunday, it was not a toxic skip fire, but the Daily Mail was, and then he moved to the Daily Mail, which meant the Daily Mail started moving away from being a toxic skip fire, but the Mail on Sunday still was, and now it's more or less the same operation. And they ran the story mocking builders for talking about their feelings and reading books, as if somehow that's not really the sort of thing that builders should be doing. And I just caught this. It's been tweeted by the GMB union, and it's just a really lovely postscript to the conversation that we had yesterday.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm a GMB union rep in construction at HBC, Europe's largest construction site. And I've got a message for the Mail newspaper about your story calling us all woke. We work long hours in a manual job for long stretches away from our family and friends. We have the highest suicide rate among male occupations. It's not easy being away from your home and family, but I guess you wouldn't understand that. So if you think it's a laugh to take the mick out of us about yoga and meditation and other things like our feelings, speaking to each other about our mental health, you need to give your head a wobble and get in the real world. Mental health's massive and people need to speak to each other. Talking to each other saves lives. Forget your diverse culture wars and your woke narratives, and we'll carry on looking out for each other here on our mental health at HPC. And we'll carry on reading the proper newspaper as well, a working man's newspaper. And we absolutely love a breakfast, so get your facts right.
Well played, Jamie. I love that. I should add, for those of you who haven't seen the clip, that he holds up a copy of the Daily Mirror at that point. It's coming up to 12:55. I make of this what you will. Government's just announced a 10% increase for pensioners. I mean, okay, so 3% for public sector workers is inflationary, can't be done. But the pensioners are getting 10%. Don't even bother Googling why they've done that. I'll tell you why they've done that, because the older you are, the more likely you are to vote Tory, or indeed to vote for Brexit. So you just get a cash bonus now, while the people running the railways are treated to a masterclass in demonisation and division. Isn't life grand? Aviation next, I imagine. Edward's in Manchester. Edward, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First-time caller. I was actually motivated to call in because one of my previous colleagues, Dan, had called in previously.
So you're listening to the radio and your old colleague is...
I was slowly joining the dots in my head and I was like, that sounds like Dan. And then obviously it goes on. But I just wanted to agree with his sentiment. He used the phrase race to the bottom. I couldn't agree with that more. So I was made redundant at a similar time.
Crazy.
And yeah, the aviation industry, it kind of gets away with a bit more than most industries do, because a lot of the people that work in it kind of have this shared passion for the aircraft, or the whole thing. So it's been, throughout, even before COVID, things were getting worse and worse. During COVID, it really gave them an opportunity to kind of push the limits. How many people can we get on furlough, and how many people can we operate the aircraft, in the airport with at a minimum, and how fine can we cut our margins? And as things have kind of opened back up, they've asked for people to come back. And as Dan said, on lower wages, we've all gone and found other jobs now. Yeah. So we've not done that. And things, I think, your researcher asked me, will things return to normal? They will, because people need to go on holiday.
Well, they will only when there's bodies filling the jobs that no one's filling at the moment. And where are those bodies going to come from, Edward?
Well, they'll find a way. I think they will. They'll pay more. They'll
find a way to get away.
They're drafting people in from other airports. They will find a way. The industry keeps moving. But the problem is that, it was an industry that had some kind of prestige to it. There's even pilots now, I think. I
hear from a lot of very dismayed pilots, very disillusioned pilots.
Well, I am one, and I won't get too political on the radio because I don't want to make enemies, but Brexit has devastated... No, I'd rather not.
Okay.
Brexit has devastated the privileges that the UK had as a kind of a base for training pilots. It's made it very difficult. And if you get time, it might be worth looking at.
I will.
But
you can't fix that then. Well, you've got a government that's claiming Brexit's a glorious, roaring success, can you? I mean, how can you fix a problem caused by Brexit when you're not admitting that Brexit's caused any problems?
Well, I'm very opinionated on this, James, and I would tend to agree with you, but I won't do so on national radio.
It was a question. It was a question. Yeah, of course it does, and they can't address it. Is my point that unless they say that there is something that needs addressing, you can't address something while denying that there's anything that needs addressing.
No, I think that's the frustration because as where we're sitting, the fix is very easy. They just need to sit down with the European Aviation Agency and come to some kind of agreement to recognise our license.
I am going to have a little look at this, in the ongoing attempt to understand the mess that has been inflicted upon our aviation industry, in part by circumstance, no doubt, in part perhaps by government incompetence, absence of clarity and leadership, which is, of course, the catchphrase of this outfit, and in part, no doubt, like every other problem in the country, it's been exacerbated by the astonishing decision of the United Kingdom to become the first country in the history of humanity to impose economic sanctions on itself. But I stress again, it's all Keir Starmer's fault. And if you are to stub your toe getting out of the bath later today, please remember to blame Keir Starmer. It's coming up to 1 o'clock. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. 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 And now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.